Subcommittee will come to order. Before we start, I want to recognize Chairman DeFazio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the commemoration of this long-anticipated occasion, your first chairing of the Subcommittee on Aviation, I have here a small gift, so hopefully that will come in handy.
Craft Brewery from Oregon.
That's after the hearing.
Oh. Then we better finish afternoon. Oh, look at that. Very nice. Thank you very much, Peter.
A gavel, which is commemorative.
It's got my name on it, so I never have to give this one away.
Right.
Well, then I'll we'll take a recess and come back in order with the new gavel. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it. Garrett will take the other one. So do you want me to do this? Yeah. Okay. So I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee today be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. And I want to say good morning to everyone and welcome to the first Aviation Subcommittee hearing of the 116th Congress. 19 days ago, the partial government shutdown ended, but left significant consequences to the U.S. aviation workforce, industry, and economy in its wake. But we have a forward-looking aviation and aerospace agenda for this Congress. In fact, it was my intention for the first hearing of the subcommittee to begin exploring that agenda that included ensuring aviation safety, fostering innovation in the U.S. airspace, improving U.S. competitiveness in the global marketplace, and enhancing the air travel experience for passengers. This agenda is still my agenda. The subcommittee will continue to pursue it. However, the recent shutdown shed new light on its impacts on the aviation industry and the workforce. But the roots of this hearing go back at least to 2013, and that shutdown under a Democratic administration when FAA employees were furloughed and air traffic controllers worked without pay. Even then, we were trying to find a way to shield this most critical part of the government from future shutdowns. So the purpose of this hearing, then, is twofold. First, I want to ensure that the subcommittee creates the public record of shutdown impacts on the aviation and aerospace industry. The panel assembled here today is in the best position to explain these impacts. I would note that the shutdown has also delayed this subcommittee's work. FAA furloughs have delayed implementation of last year's FAA reauthorization, which in turn delays the oversight mission of the subcommittee. The shutdown also delayed planning for the subcommittee's trip to the FAA Tech Center to observe their critical research to improve the safety of the national airspace. The second purpose of this hearing is to build a case for H.R. 1108, the Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2019. I want to ensure that the FAA has resources and funding stability needed to preserve the safety of the nation's aviation system. Throughout this most recent shutdown, I met with the dedicated women and men of the aviation workforce and did hear about the harmful impacts the shutdown had on their lives. One constituent from Bellingham, Washington, shared with me that her brother, an air traffic controller, worked more than 60 hours a week without pay during the shutdown. Her brother faced severe mental and physical stress, wondering when his next paycheck would come. Aerospace companies in Northwest Washington State let me know that they feared they would need to suspend production. Local aviation safety personnel showed me their pay stubs for $0. Another air traffic controller with whom I had met had to dip into her children's college savings to get by. During the shutdown, thousands of air traffic controllers, engineers, technicians, and critical safety personnel were working without pay. U.S. aviation is the gold standard of flight because of these skilled individuals. Their work ensures the safety of the traveling public and efficiency of the U.S. airspace. As I noted, the FAA was unable to begin implementation of congressional mandates in the FAA reauthorization, such as requiring 10 hours of rest for flight attendants, further integrating new users in the airspace, and setting up rules to address sexual harassment of employees, passengers, and crew. Furloughed FAA inspectors were unable to approve new aircraft, aviation products, and infrastructure, hindering U.S. global competitiveness. The FAA's work on streamlining the certification process for aviation and aerospace products came to a halt. New Airport Improvement Program grants could be issued. No new airport improvement grants could be issued, hurting projects to modernize and maintain airports. And as the full committee heard last week, federal aviation infrastructure investment falls short already of growing needs. Washington State alone needs over $190 billion in infrastructure investments, with aviation projects requiring $12.6 billion. Congress must do what it can to ensure that the FAA, its employees, and the U.S. aviation economy are protected from another government shutdown. So to this end, Committee Chair DeFazio and I introduced legislation that authorizes the FAA to continue to draw from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, AATF, during a funding lapse and operate at current levels with no congressional action required. The partial government shutdown unnecessarily hurt American families and jeopardized the safety of the largest, busiest, and most complex airspace system in the world. To use a metaphor, the lights must stay on at the runways across the United States. And I appreciate the witnesses for taking the time to join today's discussion and for your work during the shutdown. I look forward to hearing more about the impacts on your members and how Congress can support you in the future. It's my hope that with this hearing, the subcommittee will have made its case that the shutdown impacts are harmful to the economy and that the Aviation Funding Stability Act is the mechanism to shield the FAA and the aviation aerospace economy from detrimental impacts of future shutdowns. And I look forward to getting this subcommittee back to its forward-looking agenda of ensuring aviation safety, fostering innovation in U.S. airspace, improving U.S. competitiveness in the global marketplace, and enhancing the air travel experience for passengers. And with that, I yield back 17 seconds. Thank you. And I want to now call, though, on ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Sam Graves, for the for the ranking member statement.
Thank you, Chairman Larson. Congratulations on being appointed to chairman. It's always good. I guess with the green, if you think about it, we've probably averted another shutdown. That's the good news. But with the Green New Deal or the Green Dream, I guess we're not going to have to worry about that in aviation anymore because we're going to shut down the whole aviation sector and all 11 million jobs that go along with that.
A point I've made myself.
Today, my actual purpose today is I want to thank the NADC employees, the past employees, and all the federal employees who worked without pay during the shutdown to keep the economy moving and our skies safe. And I understand that during the entire duration of the shutdown, while the number of operations were up from the same time as last year, there were no increase in serious safety incidents, and we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude for the professionalism that was displayed under some very difficult circumstances. As we learn more about the short and long-term impacts of the shutdown, Congress has to hear, I believe, from the FAA and the Department of Transportation about how the shutdown played out and what efforts are underway to recover from those obvious impacts. This information, I think, is vital to us to truly understand the scope of the situation. So with that, I thank you again for having this hearing, important hearing, and appreciate the opportunity very much.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Now recognize the Chair of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for a statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Your election, we don't appoint him on our side, Sam. We elect him. Is a high point, and I think it's going to benefit aviation and the industry very well. Like the two before me, I want to thank all of those who worked without pay during the 35 days. I also want to thank those who were furloughed and come back to a mountain of work and feel like maybe that they're not essential. They are essential, and I want to assure them that that, in part, is why we have this legislation for us today. I met with local employees, including air traffic controllers, and one younger, newer controller was working overtime because my tower, like many across the country, is understaffed, so they're already working overtime shifts. But he also, because of lack of pay, had to take a job as an Uber driver. So how rested is that young man if he works extra hours in a very stressful job and then undertakes something else that barely makes him minimum wage so that they can at least put food on the table? That just can't happen again. And that certainly happened to people, and I'm sure TSA workers and many others were doing that in addition to the garage sales and all those other stupid things that were recommended they do or they had to do out of necessity. I'm concerned that the system wasn't as safe as it could and should be during the shutdown because of the reason I already mentioned, people stressed out, not getting paychecks, doing extra work to provide for their families. Aviation is too critical to allow this to happen again, and we still haven't gotten over the impacts of the 2013 shutdown where the school was closed and a bunch of the people who were in the school, some of them aged out actually, and others just didn't come back. And I imagine this time it might even be worse because it was a longer shutdown, and they're going to question, boy, am I going to go through this rigorous training process to get a job where every once in a while I'm working for free? So we're discouraging the next generation, and we're already at a critical point with so many people eligible to retire. And by the way, if they say, wow, retirees got paid and I didn't, maybe it's time for me to pull the plug, they're not going to be there to train that next generation of air traffic controllers. So we've got to provide some certainty to those who are working there now and those who want to work there in the future and those who work in other aspects. The critical things that the FAA is working on didn't get done. It took me 3 years to finally push back against the model aircraft people and require that we have remote drone identification, which is absolutely critical, or we're going to be shutting down airports all around the country because some idiot is illegally flying their drone and we can't find them. And sooner or later, they're going to fly one into a turbine engine, and maybe we're going to have a catastrophic failure. So they've got to get that rule out. The flight attendant duty time rule was delayed. Many other critical rulemakings were delayed at the FAA. So, that's why we've introduced this legislation. The FAA is unique. It pays for itself. Why should they be subject to a shutdown? And it is so critical, and it's so safety critical, and it's internationally critical. This is, I think, a common sense piece of legislation. I'm hopeful that once we get whatever deal is coming forth this week passed, if we get it passed, and if it gets signed by the president, and we don't have another shutdown, which I'm cautiously optimistic, that people will look favorably upon our legislation as a way of preventing this sort of dysfunction in the future. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would now like to move to the panel. Do you want? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, first I'll move to to Mr. Graves. The other Mr. Graves, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to congratulate you for assuming the chairmanship of the subcommittee. I look forward to working with you and continuing the longstanding bipartisan tradition that this committee and subcommittee has held. And I look forward also, Mr. DeFazio, and continuing to work with you and building on some of the success we've had in recent years on transportation, highway bill, the water resources bill, the disaster bill, FAA bill, and others. Ranking Member Graves, I want to thank you for the confidence that you've instilled in appointing us to this position, and looking forward to working with you and the other leadership to implement the FAA authorization bill and many other important priorities. First, I want to thank the FAA employees and many other federal employees who worked during the shutdown without being paid. Let's be clear on what a shutdown is. A shutdown is a failure of elected officials to do their job. I feel very much for the federal employees that were working without pay because, one, you didn't do anything to deserve it. Two, you can't do anything to solve it. And I think that's unfair. In regard to us, I think that one of the real solutions is actually to force members of Congress to not get paid during a shutdown and make it automatic to where we feel the pain as much or more so than any other federal employee that's subjected to our inability to come up with solutions. We did donate. We tried to reject our pay from December. We did donate all of our pay from December during the shutdown to various organizations, including Coast Guard Foundation, Coast Guard Mutual Assistance, and others. We worked on a daily basis to bring food to federal employees at TSA, FAA, Coast Guard, federal law enforcement agencies, and others, in many cases working together with Congressman Cedric Richmond in an effort to somewhat temper the blow and also show strong support to the federal employees that were stuck in the predicament that they were. While I know that the focus right now is on the last shutdown, and I get it, it's the one that is on everyone's minds, I think it's also important to keep in mind that during the Carter administration, I believe we had 56 days worth of shutdowns. During the Obama administration, we had a 16-day shutdown, and the second longest shutdown in American history, or in recent history at least, was during the Clinton administration. And I say it again, it's a failure of our ability to do our jobs, and I think it's inappropriate. And I hate that federal employees ended up carrying the burden of this, but it is important also, as Ranking Member Graves noted, that it looks like we are going to be able to avert a shutdown and provide a full fiscal year budget through September 30th of this year and immediately begin working on the FY20 budget, and I'm excited and looking forward to the opportunity to work with you all on the authorization components of those to make sure that we can continue to have a functional government moving forward. So I want to say again, I want to thank you for being here. I'm sorry that the federal employees were impacted the way that they were, and I'm looking forward to working with Chairman Larson to continue implementation of the FAA Authorization Act and many other important priorities within the aviation industry. Yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Graves, for your comments. Appreciate that very much. And now let's turn to the panel. I want to welcome our witnesses, Mr. Paul Rinaldi, President of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, AFL-CIO, Mr. Mike Perrone, National President, Professional Aviation Safety Specialist, Mr. Nicholas E. Callio, President and CEO of Airlines for America, Ms. Sarah Nelson, International President, Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, and Mr. Pete Bunce, President and CEO of General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Thank you for being here today. We all look forward to your testimony, and I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So we'll proceed with testimony, starting with Mr. Rinaldi.
Thank you, Chairman Lawson, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the negative effects of the 35-day shutdown on the members of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Every day, over 70,000 flights and 2 million passengers move through our national airspace system. Although it's the safest system in the world, during the shutdown, many of our programs that reduce the risk and enhance the safety of the system have come to a complete stop. At the time of the shutdown finally ended, I believe the system was on the verge of unraveling. Even though the system is safer today than it was during the shutdown, it is still less safe than it was before the shutdown. The shutdown eroded critical layers that are necessary to support and maintain the safety of the national airspace system. For example, programs to prevent wrong surface landings were paused. Each year, we have more than 200 events in which aircraft lands, attempts to land on wrong runways, taxiways, or even, believe it or not, the entirely wrong airport. Most recently, last week at Philadelphia International Airport, a flight was cleared to land on runway 35, but it aligned itself up with the parallel taxiway of taxiway Echo. A runway safety enhancement called ATTAP alerted the controller immediately, who instructed the pilot to execute a go-around. The pilot overflew 2 commercial airplanes on the taxiway by 600 feet. ATTAP is deployed in 6 airports across this country. Prior to the shutdown, the FAA is scheduled to deploy ATTAP at 13 major additional airports by the end of March. That implementation is now delayed to the end of June. In addition, the FAA has stopped addressing the risk identified through our voluntary safety reporting program, ATSAP. ATTAP and ATSAP are just 2 of dozen programs that are now significantly delayed and were not functioning correctly during the shutdown. That's what makes the system less safe today. Mr. Chairman, on January 25th, travelers experienced delays due to decreased capacity. Because the system is complex and interconnected, when delays occur at one facility, it ripples across the entire system. On that day, a small number of controllers in critically staffed areas of 2 facilities individually determined they were not fit for duty. NACA did not coordinate these absences. This was a result of illness and the stress of working over a month without getting paid and not knowing when you're going to get paid. NACA does not condone or approve any federal employee participating in coordinating activity that negatively affects the capacity of the national airspace system. Mr. Chairman, the pressure and the extra stress that was inserted into our national airspace system because of the shutdown was intense. We were getting text messages from controllers with 17 years' worth of experience, making mistakes on routine clearances, climbing airplanes into paths of other airplanes at the same altitude because they were distracted, because they were thinking about their mortgage. They were thinking about school payments, car payments, food. They were thinking about the shutdown. They were fatigued. They were not focused at the task at hand. We had controllers going to work every day, driving Ubers, waiting on tables to take care of their family. We have worked really hard to mitigate distractions and reduce the fatigue in our work environment. But this shutdown increased fatigue and inserted all types of distractions in our control rooms. Add insult to injury, our workforce still has not been made financially whole. This is completely unacceptable, inserting this type of risk into our system. As you know, we're at a 30-year low of fully certified controllers in the system, of which 20% of them can retire at any moment. If 20% retire tomorrow because we look at another shutdown, we will not be able to run the volume of traffic we do today. It takes 3 to 5 years to mentor an apprentice to become fully certified controller. The FAA had to stop their hiring and shut down the training academy because of this shutdown. Our staffing crisis is exacerbated by this shutdown. We need to make sure this never happens again. I want to thank Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, along with Acting Administrator Dan Elwell, and the ATO Chief Operating Officer Terry Bristol for their leadership through this unacceptable challenge of the national airspace system. Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Lawson, I applaud you for introducing the Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2019, H.R. 1108. NACA strongly supports this bill because it meets our 4 core principles. It ensures the safety and efficiency of the national airspace system. It protects the frontline workforce. The bill provides stable, predictable funding for our national airspace system, and it gives the ability to continue to provide service to all the users of the Aviation Committee. NACA urges all members of Congress to support this legislation. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rinaldi. Mr. Perone, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Lawson, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Professional Aviation Safety Specialist to discuss the impacts of the recent government shutdown. The impacts of the shutdown resonated throughout the industry as aviation safety inspectors and many others sat idly on the sidelines for weeks. Frustration grew, morale dropped, while modernization was brought to a standstill. In addition, the FAA's ability to recruit and retain highly skilled workers may have been severely damaged. PASS represents approximately 11,000 FAA employees nationwide, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and American Samoa. They install, maintain, support, and certify complex air traffic control equipment. They inspect and oversee the commercial and general aviation industries. They develop flight procedures and perform quality analysis of aviation systems used in air traffic control. They aid in the building and restoring of air traffic control facilities as well. These employees are the voice of aviation safety. They provide a unique insight into the system that maintain in the industry they oversee. Our members are tasked in ensuring that the U.S. aviation system remains the safest in the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yet, for 35 days, many of them were not performing their duties. Those who were on the job were working under stressful conditions without pay, while some worked over 10-hour shifts. Dedicated federal employees, many of them lifelong public servants and military veterans, became collateral damage in a dispute unrelated to aviation safety. Employees within the FAA's Office of Aviation Safety represent the backbone of the system. They develop regulatory standards and ensure your aircraft and those responsible for keeping it in the sky are up to the task and in full regulatory compliance. But when the shutdown began, thousands of aviation safety inspectors were furloughed and told not to report to work. They wanted to, but they couldn't. For 35 days, the FAA's safety oversight was severely curtailed. With each passing day, a layer of safety was stripped away as the system became more exposed to risk. For example, the FAA was not overseeing foreign repair stations for 35 days, and the world knew it. This is not an acceptable standard. The aviation industry depends on vital certification work that past represented employees perform. But during the shutdown, important certification activities were on hold. The FAA and the aviation industry will likely feel the effects of this shutdown for years to come. Thousands of other FAA employees, primarily in the Air Traffic Organization, or ATO, remained on the job without pay. This includes airway transportation system specialists as well as other safety professionals. Modernization of the system was brought to a halt. Implementation of next-gen programs, procedures, and equipment were not being deployed, and training was halted. This will inevitably lead to delays in the implementation of new technologies and procedures. Again, the long-term impacts of the shutdown will resonate throughout the industry. As stated before, The agency's ability to attract and retain highly skilled employees after the shutdown may have been damaged. Employees trained and certified by the government will look to the private sector for job security. Inspectors are fleeing to the private sector, and years of experience will be lost. The call to public service may be lost as well. The human impact must be considered. The timing of the shutdown, before and after the holidays, could not have been worse. FAA employees needed to be focused on critical duties, not on whether they can pay their bills or if they need a second job to put food on the table. During the shutdown, I heard from one of my members in Gonzales, Louisiana, who was an administrative side of the House and was furloughed during the shutdown. She's a single mother of 3 and putting 2 children through college. She's also a veteran who dutifully served her country. Yet, for 35 days, her main concern was the shutdown and when she would be able to pay her bills. She told me of the psychological effects and the stress it put on her and her family. She deserves better than this. All federal employees deserve better than this. In closing, PASS emphasizes that every day the government is shut down, our country is gambling with aviation safety. We can't subject the flying public to unnecessary risk due to political disagreements. Aviation safety is like a team sport. Without support staff, facilities would not operate at an optimum level. Without technicians, air traffic controllers would not be able to perform their job. And without inspectors, the aviation system becomes less safe and efficient. The full team needs to be on the job, free of unnecessary burdens unrelated to the mission. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on this important issue, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perone. Now recognize Mr. Callio for 5 minutes. That microphone.
Thank you. Thank you to Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member Graves for the opportunity to testify today. On behalf of Airlines for America and its members, the country's leading passenger and cargo carriers, we appreciate the committee's leadership and focus on this timely issue of shutdown impacts and potential solutions. We also want to sincerely thank those federal employees who went to work every day during the partial shutdown, even though they were not being compensated. This includes our partners at the FAA, TSA, and CBP. Despite significant and prolonged hardship, they kept the U.S. aviation system operating, and they ensured the safety and security of the traveling and shipping public. We all are extremely grateful to our association and the carriers. We are all extremely grateful, and our association and carriers were pleased to be able to make significant contributions to the nonprofit groups that were assisting federal employees as they suffered through this hardship. Chairman Larson, as you noted, and Ranking Member Graves, as you noted, this is at least the 4th shutdown that these workers have suffered since 2011 through 2 different administrations. I know we are here to memorialize the impacts of this shutdown, and we should, but our hope is that we come out of this united in an effort to make sure that this never happens again. That should be our goal for today and going forward. So Chairman DeFazio and Chairman Larson, we want to thank you specifically for your leadership in putting forward a solution that would keep the FAA fully funded and operational with paid employees, thereby alleviating the serious impacts repeatedly experienced by the entire aviation industry. H.R. 1108 and Chairman DeFazio, you for your past efforts to redirect diverted TSA revenues are greatly appreciated. And frankly, there is a silver lining here. Everyone at this table supports the legislation, and the entire industry is galvanized and united as never before. I would be remiss not to mention and thank Secretary Chow at the Department of Transportation and Acting Administrator Elwell for all they did to guarantee that the FAA continued to operate safely, and I stress safely and as efficiently as possible for the traveling and shipping public. For air travel, the impact of the shutdown was particularly acute. While my written testimony contains a broader list of impacts that the shutdown had on our industry, and both Mr. Rinaldi and Mr. Perone have laid forth many of those impacts, I want to mention just a few. Alaska Airlines had to delay the start of commercial service from Payne Field in Washington, forcing already booked travelers to go back through Seattle. Southwest has new service to Hawaii. It's been delayed. That means less competition and fewer options until the airline can gain FAA approval, which is now delayed. Federal inspectors were not being paid, reducing the amount of oversight of the industry. Hiring new pilots into the workforce and promoting existing pilots was also frozen since the FAA was not able to process the required checks nor issue new pilot certificates. This is particularly harmful to the regional airlines who are having workforce issues. I endorse everything Mr. Rinaldi said. I can't say anything better about the impact on the air traffic controllers. Just a couple of more overt impacts that are not that visible to the public. New planes were not able to be put into service. Collaborative planning for the summer season, which takes place every year and is critically important to how we handle convective issues in the summer, just like snow in the winter, has not taken place and is behind schedule. We will feel the impact of that come this summer. We won't realize it's happened because of the shutdown. So with that, I'm going to move on and just say, in closing, we've talked about Next Gen. The start and stop on Next Gen is considerable. Every time the government shuts down, we have to turn off these projects. It has a real impact, and it's cumulative over the years, and you can't make it up. You can't just flick the switch back on. This most recent shutdown, it's over 1/12 of the entire year. So again, Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, we can't allow this to happen again. We've got a $6 billion trust fund. The money gets paid into that trust fund whether the government is operating or not. We ought to move forward and find a solution to this. Your legislation is a start. A4 will support any solution that works so that we don't have to worry about another shutdown. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Callio. I now recognize for 5 minutes Sarah Nelson. Ms. Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman Larson, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and Ranking Member Graves, for the opportunity to testify on the impact of the longest government shutdown in our history. My name is Sarah Nelson, International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, representing nearly 50,000 of aviation's first responders at 20 airlines. Just last week, I attended my annual safety and security training required for my qualifications as a certified flight attendant. And rule number 1, when performing safety-sensitive work, is to remove all distractions and focus. Flight attendants artfully complete safety tasks, shifting on a moment's notice from the emotional intelligence our job requires to the total focus it takes to perform safety and security duties. And we should talk about addressing the inadequate FAA minimum staffing regulations currently in place once we know our industry is on safe ground. Today, though, we must focus on the distractions created by this shutdown and the impact it had on running a safe and secure system. For decades, those who want to privatize every government program have vilified government workers as nameless, faceless bureaucrats. But the truth is, these are the people who keep us safe. They are the people who live and work in our communities. If they can't do their job, flight attendants can't do our job. And no one gets out of this unscathed because aviation is what connects and moves our entire economy. This is about our safety, our security, and our jobs. Shutdowns are never good. Our current experience is unprecedented. We can never allow it to happen again. Picture this. Airline pilots typically maintain what they call a sterile cockpit during takeoff and landing when no communication is permitted between the cabin and the flight deck. This is to allow pilots to focus on the most difficult and task-intensive parts of the flight. But during the shutdown, some pilots briefed flight attendants that there would be no sterile cockpit on their flight. They were so concerned that the shutdown had compromised security screening that they felt they needed to alter safety procedures so they could be informed immediately if there was a security issue in the cabin. Air travel is a fully integrated operation that relies on government and private industry working together. When any link in this chain breaks down, the whole system suffers. We still feel the shock and horror of losing our flying partners because of gaps in security. We never shake that grief, nor the loss we've experienced for years with furloughs and bankruptcies. Safety and security is non-negotiable. It is critical that Washington stop the threat of day 36 and take steps to ensure this never happens again. We hope that does happen this week. AFA fully supports the proposed Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2019. This legislation makes sense because there's absolutely no argument to close the government when funding exists specifically related to the functions of the FAA, and we urge immediate action on this along with all of our colleagues. Still, we've seen that aviation relies on many areas of government to keep us safe. We call on lawmakers to ensure government workers are never locked out again. We also worked with this committee to lock in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, including critical issues that matter for safety of flight attendants, pilots, and our passengers. The shutdown stopped implementation of this bill. Flight attendant fatigue exists today. The bill includes improved rest along with implementation of a fatigue risk management plan to close the safety loophole. Evacuation standards for certification of aircraft do not take into consideration the current cabin environment for safe evacuations. Secondary cockpit barriers are required to be installed on all new aircraft to help thwart an attempt to breach the flight deck and end the absurd policy of expecting flight attendants to serve as that physical barrier. The bill addresses these issues too, along with sexual assault prevention, reporting, and response, among hundreds of other safety initiatives. Again, none of this has been implemented, and the shutdown made it impossible to move forward with accountability. Flight attendants started to experience the economic impact of the shutdown, and as did our communities. For example, delaying the Payne Field opening to commercial traffic caused flight attendants to lose flying, lose pay, and the same is true for pilots and other workers. In addition, the economic impact to Everett includes cancellation of over 600 crew room overnights in hotels. This also means other travelers aren't staying in those hotels, eating at nearby restaurants, using transportation, or otherwise spending in the community. At many airlines, flights were canceled because the FAA could not sign off on delivery of aircraft. More work lost. This was the tip of the iceberg, though. 11 million Americans who do work related to our industry were in jeopardy. This hampered our ability to compete with the world, and it created damage that may last for years. There is bipartisan support to keep the government open with stable, long-term funding. Americans overwhelmingly support this. If Washington will not put an end to this crisis, we will take action to save lives and protect U.S. aviation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Now turn to Mr. Peter Bunce and recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, thanks for having me here today. For those members that are new to the subcommittee, Gamma represents those that make the actual aircraft itself, the engines, the avionics, large maintenance, repair, overhaul facilities, and training providers, and we are a global association. If you look at what we have done over the last 10 years, working very hand-in-hand with our colleagues, Mr. Perone's organization, along with this committee, we have implemented certification reform that without would have absolutely devastated our industry during this shutdown. So we are very thankful for the cooperative way we've worked with this. And I want to just echo what my colleagues here have said at the table. The legislation that has been put forward with the Aviation Funding and Stability Act is something that's united the industry that I haven't seen in the time that I've been at the association. And the only reason that we only had 40 logos on the letter that you saw yesterday was just we didn't have time. We wanted to get it out before this hearing because there would have been many more. So you have universal support for this legislation going forward. Now, because we had the certification reform, we were able to still function during the shutdown, but that does not mean that it did not have significant impact to the manufacturers and maintenance providers. And I want to give you just 2 quick examples, and I'll use one from Louisiana. So you have a rotorcraft company that provides emergency medical support throughout the nation. In fact, here in Washington, D.C., those that we hear in the life flight helicopters were provided by this company. They do supplemental type certificate modifications to these aircraft so that they can go ahead and do it. They were stalled. They weren't able to get these aircraft to market. When you have to make bets as a manufacturer or a supplier that you're going to be able to deliver product to your customer on time. If you don't, you default on those contracts. So that has significant impact, and it ripples through the system. Another example in Washington State. In the central part or western part of the state, we have a manufacturer making small aircraft. In fact, it's still fabric covered. And the impact on them was cascading all during the shutdown. So they couldn't move airplanes that were already produced off the ramp to foreign buyers that bought the aircraft because validations all have to go through the FAA, and they were all stalled. When they go and they make an aircraft and they drill a hole, if the hole is misdrilled and it's a little bit larger, then you have a deviation from the type design. You have to get permission from the FAA to put a bigger rivet in it. That's how highly regulated our industry is, like no other. And so you have ripple effects all throughout the system. So during the shutdown, we had very open lines of communication to the FAA leadership. And I just want to echo what my colleagues have said. Acting Administrator Elwell, Ali Barami, who runs the safety division, Terry Bristol on the air traffic control side, and up to Secretary Chow. They did everything within the limits of the law to be able to listen to us and try to mitigate as best they could. But all of these effects were compounding. So when you go into a shutdown and start planning for it, and that happened this week, all of a sudden activity starts to slow down because they've got to get ready for the shutdown. And then once the shutdown is over with, our calculation, which is bared out with the previous shutdowns that Ranking Member Graves mentioned, it's usually about 3 to 4 weeks for every 1 week of shutdown, because you're not just having to clean out your inbox. You got to keep pace of this increasing amount of activity that's coming at Mr. Perrone's people. So the safety part of the FAA, you know, we as manufacturers, a lot of us fly in the system, and we touch Mr. Rinaldi's people all the time, and the selfless performance they did during the shutdown is so much appreciated. But Mr. Perrone's folks are kind of, for us as manufacturers and maintenance providers and training providers, they're the unsung heroes, because they sit there and they allow us, with the safety oversight that permeates every single thing that we do. And without them to be able to approve each and every part of the process, the system starts to break down, the recovery becomes very long. So now moving forward, it's very important for us as manufacturers to implement what you all did last year in the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. There continues to be significant reforms out there in certification, and we had a lot of lessons learned during this shutdown. We learned that at delegated authorities or ODAs that are managed in one part of the country aren't managed the same in others. So there's a lot of things that we will be able to capture. But I would ask this committee, as we move forward, these reforms are important, and we need to keep them online, because we have tremendous new equipment coming into the system. A lot of attention is paid to commercial drones, but we got on-demand air mobility coming very quickly. And commercial space, we're going to see launches this year on significant commercial space operations. So we need to make sure that the pressure remains and the oversight maintains on the FAA to be able to go and drive last year's reforms across the goal line. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bunce. Now move to questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I just want to make a point about Mr. Bunce's last point. I hope one of our next hearings will be on U.S. innovation in the airspace, and it will include discussion of these issues like air taxis and commercial space. This committee needs to get more on top of those issues, because this aviation and aerospace includes flying by an airplane and flying in an airplane, but it also is beginning to include much more these issues of drones, of commercial space, of air taxis, and we need to get on top of that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Mr. Rinaldi, according to your testimony, classes resumed last week at the Training Academy in Oklahoma City. I say resumed because they were stopped during the recent shutdown. Can you describe how the closure of the academy affects the pipeline of new controllers and the ability to meet hiring targets this year, or any year we have a shutdown for that matter?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes. There's 22 classes up and running right now. Obviously, if we shut down on Friday, they'll all go home again. That is horribly disruptive to the pipeline of getting controllers out to the facilities and start that 3 to 5 year process of apprenticeship. There are limited spaces at the academy, and we are concerned that the agency is not going to be able to meet their hiring goal because it's been closed for 35, actually it was longer than 35 days, and another shutdown would just close that pipeline for a long time.
So can you then, let's move to another question about retraining the controller workforce on Datacom, one of the technologies. Why would there be a need to retrain that workforce on Datacom when the FAA has already spent $8 million on training? Why does that training need to be repeated?
Datacom is new technology which is pretty evasive, and it changed the way the controllers issue clearances back and forth from the pilots. It is something that needs to be fresh. And it's something you need to do every day. It almost needs to become second nature. So as we went through 35 days of not training, As we approach the 45-day period, you have to do a full training process because it's the implementation just won't be smooth.
Yeah. Mr. Perone, you mentioned with your inspectors and technicians and the delay for them. You know, from your perspective, is there any way for us to catch up, or are we just going to have to trundle our way through months before we get caught up again?
Thank you. Yeah, the problem is during that 35 days, as was said, the industry continued moving forward. They continued to put aircraft in the pipeline. They continued to make sure that they did their part. Our inspectors were not working, so they just had paperwork sitting on their desk, sitting in the inbox. After they came back to work, and I know they came back a little earlier than the full 35 days, but they had to make up for that time, plus every day there's new information out that they have to review. So it's going to take a long time. And this 3-week period of uncertainty, is the government going to shut down again? Is it not? The FAA had to move priorities around. They weren't sure what they needed to do, and the industry had to let them know and work with them to figure out what's next. So that's the problem. It's not like somebody said, turn on a switch, back to work, here we go. You continue to have the day-to-day operation plus the 35-plus days that were sitting idle.
Thank you. Mr. Callio, can you provide the committee with additional impacts to the airline industry during the shutdown? You mentioned some airplane deliveries as an example. Are there additional impacts?
Sure. There were airworthiness directives that we couldn't get approved because the employees were not on the job to do it. Again, there was NextGen. There were if you look at how we fly and trying to get online, we had planes that needed to be recertified. Those could get knocked back online. Again, there are so many hidden impacts that they're detailed in our written testimony, and those are the things we ought to be focusing on to stop from happening again, because as we all agree, and I'm the one who said it, you can't just flick the switch back on and make these things happen. So what we were doing, Mr. Chairman, was monitoring our airlines' short-term impacts, mid-term impacts, and long-term impacts. We were piecing and patching, as was the FAA and DOT, to try to ameliorate the short-term impacts. But as you look at it, it grows down the line. The midterm becomes longer, and there's a buildup there, as Mr. Perone said, and then the long-term keeps up. We are still suffering from 2013, and every time we add to it, it's wrong, which is why the legislation that you've introduced is so important.
Thanks. Ms. Nelson, other impacts of the shutdown or any shutdown on flight attendants?
Flight attendants know that we were on the edge of facing a real disaster for our jobs, but more so, flight attendants were expressing extraordinary concern about safety and security. We have seen critical incidents, and we have seen those who wish to do ill will. And in each of those cases, we didn't have any warning for it. And what flight attendants were very aware of was that in those instances, if we had known, we would have pulled our friends off those flights. We would have told people not to go. We would have done anything that we could to avoid those situations. And they were saying to us, we have to act now because now we see that there are these gaps, and we can't stand by and let something catastrophic happen when we know that we're setting ourselves up for that.
So you're kind of the first responder in the aircraft, and you're the last to know in these circumstances.
We count on all of these people to keep us safe, to do their jobs, and when people come to the aircraft door, we are that last line of defense, and we're the first responder when something happens that goes wrong. But when we have a break in the chain of all of the safety layers that have to be in place to keep us safe, we are set up to fail, and we were saying that that's unacceptable.
Thank you. Mr. Bunce, I'll come back to you. I'm sure others have questions for you, but appreciate your comments on ODA and certification reforms. I'd like to explore that a little bit later, but I'll now turn to Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Callio, ask you a question. A lot of discussion in regard to the testimony has been focused on safety, which obviously is an appropriate topic. Would your members fly planes with passengers on board if they viewed a threat to safety?
Never.
Compromise?
And the way our system operates, it's a risk-based system. I think everybody on the panel would agree that the shutdown did introduce more risk into the system because some of the layers were missing in terms of oversight. That said, what the FAA does is and Mr. Elwell said this, and Acting Administrator Elwell said this, what we will do is compromise efficiency for safety. And you saw that at LaGuardia finally when the rubber really hit the road. What they did was a ground stop, because we will stretch the flights out, stretch out the flight times, provide less flights. So less people fly, it's more inconvenient for passengers and shippers, and it affects business, it affects the economy. But never, never will we put a plane in the air if we consider it to be unsafe.
Mr. Kelly, thank you. And I really wanted to emphasize that point because there were a lot of comments on safety that were made, and I want to make sure that we're being clear to the public, the flying public, that while I made my comments opening up about the shutdown, and I'm not going to reiterate those, I think it's inexcusable what happened. But I also think it's important that we do convey the safety factors, or I guess the lack of risk that existed during the shutdown as a result of some of the efforts by the airlines and others. Mr. Rinaldi, you made mention of an incident in Philadelphia. I'm disappointed the FAA is not here today, and I'm looking forward to having much more robust conversations with them. Are you aware of how much of that incident was a result of a pilot versus the controllers?
Well, that incident was the pilot lining up for a taxiway that's parallel to the runway. Sometimes from the cockpit, it is very confusing. The equipment that I mentioned gave the controllers a heads up that they were outside the cone of the threshold of the runway, therefore giving us an alert.
I just wanted to distinguish that pilots certainly weren't, their pay wasn't affected by the shutdown, and if this was a pilot issue, then the tying that back to the shutdown perhaps is a tenuous connection, but.
Well, the
I just
point
wanted
of
be clear.
that in my testimony was that equipment was deployed only at 6 airports, going to be at 13 additional airports if it wasn't for the shutdown, now delayed to the end of June. That was the point of my testimony.
And Mr. Rinaldi, I think I share with you and probably everyone on the panel strong concern about the delayed implementation, the continued missed milestones of Next Gen, the cost overruns and other things. I know the full committee chairman has repeatedly made reference to this. I think my favorite line is when you called it Never Gen. This is a grave concern that we have, and something that Chairman Larson and I have briefly discussed and look forward to focusing on to help get that back on track and make sure that the full scope of Next Gen is implemented in an appropriate time frame and within an appropriate budget. Another question, I mentioned earlier, and my math was wrong, I just looked at it again. I said that there were a number of shutdowns during the Carter administration. There were actually 5 shutdowns totaling 66 days. Does anyone, and I'm not asking anybody to show their ID, but anybody recall any impacts during those shutdowns and perhaps the impacts on the aviation industry?
For the Carter administration? I was in high school.
I might be old enough, but at that time I was in law school and focused on other things.
Great, thank you. I guess next question, Mr. Bunce, thanks for being here, and it's good to see you again. Can you talk about how the shutdown impacted the integration of new technology, such as unmanned aircraft, urban air mobility, and commercial space transportation into the NAS?
Absolutely, especially with, we're calling it on-demand air mobility because, you know, my hope is someday that every rural community out there has a machine that's programmed to go to a hospital and that we can put an occupant in and it's going to fly to the hospital. And we are on the cusp of this being able to happen. Back in 2015, we passed the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act unanimously by the U.S. Congress. And right now we're in that stage of trying to use those implementing rules to facilitate this new type of vehicle to be able to get into the airspace to certify it. So when we can't have Mr. Perone's people available to work on being able to set the certification standards for those types of vehicles, it is delaying this. And make no mistake that there is tremendous international competition in this area. The work that's being done in Europe and in China is absolutely dramatic, and my hope is that the U.S. stays, as Chairman Larson mentioned, the gold standard. We are an aviation nation, and we've got to keep progressing forward to be able to certify these aircraft. So it does have a big impact.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Mr. Rinaldi, there are very strict rules about your folks, just like pilots not reporting to work when they're fatigued or ill and feel they can't do the job properly. But wouldn't you say you're kind of at a constant level? A, it's a stressful job. B, we're understaffed, so people are putting in a lot of mandatory overtime. And then C, when you get like the example I had with a younger controller doing mandatory overtime, feeling compelled to drive Uber to put food on the table, do you think, I mean, he may have not been fatigued to the level that he should have stayed home, but they're not at the top of their game, right?
Certainly, fatigue was entered into the system. You know, sometimes individuals have a tough time identifying that they're too fatigued to come to work, and that might have been happening. We did see, as I said, some routine clearances where mistakes were being made because they were distracted. But we were deeply concerned about what was going on in the control towers and the control rooms throughout the country about fatigue.
All right, thank you. In addition to the extra stress. And then,
The stress was intense.
and Mr. Barone, what about your people who are told they aren't essential, told to stay home? How do they feel about coming back to work, and what's the new burden on them?
So the problem is not being essential personnel. I mean, everybody in the FAA does their job and keeps the system up and running. Again, the safest in the world, most complex. And to say you're not important for these 35 days, the morale was just tremendous that they just said, why should we stay? Why should we bother continuing working for the
A lot of
agency?
your people have technical expertise. Couldn't they find private sector jobs?
Absolutely,
They
especially the inspectors. They can go back to industry, and our technicians and workforce, they can go find other jobs because they have that unique ability to do
So if
that.
this uncertainty continues into the future about whether these are stable, long-term jobs, you may have trouble getting qualified people to fill your openings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And Ms. Nelson, we've been discussing the safety issue, and TSA would limit lines, but again, a lot of them are driving Uber, they're having garage sales, they're checking their phone to see if they sold their table or TV yet. Flight attendants had an overwhelming sense that things weren't as safe as they could be?
Flight attendants were seeing it every day when we would come to work and go through those security lines and talk with those security agents who, some of them didn't have gas to get back and forth to their homes, and so they were sleeping in their cars between shifts to make sure that they could keep the country moving. And we have to really thank them because they stayed true to their oath to serve and protect all of us. Think of that, thousands of people who came to work to make sure that that could keep going when that same oath was not held by people in power. So yes, we saw every single day that there were distractions in safety-sensitive and security-sensitive work that don't need to be there and created risk that we didn't need to have.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Callio, could you, you talked about a whole lot of things that disrupted the industry. Can you quantify a number, what the losses were or damages?
We can't. We looked at it, Mr. Chairman. We defer to our members to quantify their losses. You've heard two mentioned, I think, $25 million by one airline, $15 million by another. I actually think the number is much greater. Those quantify losses in terms of flights, lost opportunities in terms of certifications not being made. But the cumulative impact of all the things that everybody up here has mentioned add up to much, much more in terms of disruption to the system and what has to happen down the line. Also, we were taking our own employees off the line to help TSA employees and CBP employees, and so that all has an impact that I think is not readily quantifiable. Someone, of course, could come up with a number. I can't.
Okay. Thank you. Just in reference to statements that have been made, I was not here when Carter was president either. I can't quantify what happened then, but shutdowns are stupid no matter who's in the White House or who's in Congress, and they've got to end. I'm not only introducing this legislation, I'm on a bill that's been introduced in the House to say that all agencies would continue under continuing resolutions in case we don't agree on appropriations and a budget in the future at their current levels. Obviously, some more powerful committee might oppose that because they think they're losing something in that case. I don't know, but it's a stupid way to get leverage in this town. This isn't a partisan issue, and I invite all members of the House on both sides of the aisle to support this bill, move it through, and at least we can take care of one very important sector of the government and our economy by passing this legislation. It is a self-funding agency. Why can't we expend funds during a shutdown? With that, I thank the panel. I've got to go over to the other side where they don't do anything to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now we'll move to other members' questions. Just a reminder about the process. We go by seniority, seniority based on if you were here at the gavel. Then after that, if you come in after the gavel, you get in line based on when you got here. So that makes Mr. Stauber from the great state of Minnesota next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses here testifying. As Mr. Rinaldi, I was in grade school too when President Carter was our president. A couple of things I just wanted to reiterate to Mr. Bunce. Cirrus Aircraft in Duluth, Minnesota is the largest manufacturer of piston-driven aircraft. I spoke with them, and they had the certificates were delayed in sending the aircraft out. They have now been backed up about 4 months because of this. Can you talk to us about other general aviation manufacturers, some of their concerns like Cirrus had? And by the way, Cirrus Aircraft employs 1,100 people in Duluth, Minnesota, in and around Duluth, Minnesota.
Well, thank you, sir. And Cirrus also delivered the most jets last year of any manufacturer out there with a new Vision jet, so it's pretty exciting. So take another company in Florida that provides other types of aircraft out there. They were within a week of furloughing because they could not get flight test people to be able to keep their programs going. Another very large jet manufacturer, if you look at a major development program, and I've testified in front of this committee before, the burn rate for a major program is about $10 million a month. And so if you can't get the program to progress, like get flight test, what happens is those flight test people are now booked the next month with another company, so you don't just push everybody to the right. You go and you get the folks that were scheduled, and then you have to go several months later. So it really is a burn rate where it's like lighting a match to the money, and that money could have been used to go ahead and hire more people as you ramp up production once you get your certification. So it all has ripple effects for each one of the manufacturers when we have delays like that.
Thank you. Then the second comment I'd like to make, Ranking Member Graves made it, and this is about the inability to elect of elected officials in Washington to come to a compromise. And it's extremely disappointing. I hope it doesn't happen again. And you talk about safety. I have to ask this one more time. Was there any flight in this country that took off, flew, that we knowingly felt was unsafe? Anybody?
I'll take it again. I would say no.
Okay. That's to Ms. Nelson. You talked about safeties first. The flight attendants and the assistants. You guys and gals do a magnificent job. You make the flights peaceful and through some stressful situations. And I've only been a member for a month and a half. But I've flown enough to really see the spectacular job that you and your folks do, so I appreciate that. My last comment will be this. I will support 100% the aviation industry beyond 10 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. Next is Ms. Napolitano. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question is aimed at all witnesses because there's a piece of legislation that is coming up, H.R. 1108, which I have co-sponsored and introduced by Chairman DeFazio and the subcommittee Chair, Mr. Larson, that will protect the aviation industry from future shutdowns. How would this bill specifically provide the stability and predictability of your members that they require and ensure the safety of the system for all of us? Don't forget, I'm one of those that travels twice a week, up and back to California. So it is very important. Yes, the flight attendants are magnificent. I just wonder whether when we get on the plane, are we going to get there safely? Is there the attendants at either end focused on their job? Are they all right? Or are they worried about having to pay bills because they haven't been paid? So to each of you, I have the question.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. We believe it will be, this bill, if passed and enacted, will give us a seamless transition that if Congress failed to appropriate and failed to pass the CR, that we would just reach into the uncommitted balance of the Aviation Trust Fund and not worry about 10 days before preparing for a shutdown and stop implementing equipment, shutting down our academies, stopping training air traffic controllers, stop implementing and training new technology to enhance the safety of the system. So I believe by passing this, it will make it more safe and it will eliminate the risk of what happens during a shutdown.
Thank you.
Yes, PASS supports this as well. We believe, again, we have two sides. The technicians who maintain the air traffic control equipment, certify it, make sure that the air traffic controllers can use it properly, that the pilots are in communications with them, and also the regulatory side. We have the regulatory side that Flight Standards has to maintain with the industry to make sure they're following all the procedures, as we said, new equipment, existing equipment. That is ultimately where we have to be, having those folks working day in and day out. So there is no gap of should we or shouldn't we fly, should we or shouldn't we have a plane in the air, or that consideration. And everybody's focused on their job. Like I said, knock on wood, we got the safest system in the world because our men and women are out there day in and day out, and we need to have that continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. First, I'd like to say one more word about safety. You know, when you come into the industry, the first thing that everybody in the industry says in answer to any question is safety always comes first, and it does. We all operate as a team, and a plane will not get in the air if we consider it to be unsafe, sometimes to great irritation to passengers. In terms of this legislation, it would, as Mr. Rinaldi said, cut the uncertainty out, because right now, there's always a chance of a government shutdown. The effects happen. So if we know that there is stable funding, and even if the Congress cannot come to an agreement on the appropriations, we will not be affected. The money will come out of the trust fund because the money keeps going into the trust fund on a daily basis, gets repaid automatically. And it's been referenced here, and this letter, I don't know if the letter's been entered into the record, but it should. There are 40 signatories to this letter supporting H.R. 1108. As I said earlier, this latest shutdown has totally galvanized the industry. We are together. We want this legislation. Thank you.
Yes, this should be nonpartisan. Everyone agrees with this, and I've never seen the industry come together like we have around this. Well, that part feels great, yeah. So what we said was that we were less safe during this shutdown because we introduced risk that we didn't need to and that we couldn't even calculate was having an impact on our safety and security. And so we should never do that again. Our union has opposed every single shutdown for this reason. And this was the longest one, just so happens, so that many of us saw the effects much more because they grow every single day that the shutdown continues. But we absolutely have to stop this, and we've got to get this bill passed immediately. And we have to have a more fulsome response as well, but we should take care of the FAA.
Carson, I would just add that this shutdown really demonstrated how important aviation is to our entire society. We are an aviation nation. And so just like the markets react to certainty, our industry has to react to certainty. And this legislation will provide us the certainty that if something, again, happens like this that's politically driven, that we can go and keep this country running by keeping our industry running.
Thank you. It makes no sense, does it? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Napolitano. Before recognizing Representative Fitzpatrick, I ask unanimous consent the following items be entered into the record of today's hearing. A letter signed by more than 35 aviation industry and labor organizations endorsing H.R. 1108, and a letter from the commercial drone sector endorsing H.R. 1108. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Representative Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, thanks to each and every one of you for the role that you play, which oftentimes is taken for granted. Each and every one of you play a separate, distinct role that is equally important. You all did your job when this government did not. and we want to thank you for that. And I can, as I've said many times, having lived through a government shutdown as an FBI agent in 2013, there are significant, long-lasting impacts that most people don't understand. And to have a government shutdown for 35 days, I can tell you, does irreparable harm to investigations inside the Bureau, and I know it does irreparable harm to each one of your agencies. Two questions I'd like to ask you, Ms. Nelson, based on your opening testimony. First question is regard to rest periods. So there was an aviation tragedy about 10 years ago that resulted in rest requirements for pilots. Flight attendants were not included in those policy procedures and regulations. As part of the FAA reauth, those provisions were included. How did the government shutdown specifically impact that program and implementation of it?
Thank you for that question. In fact, this has been a 30-year effort to try to get fatigue addressed for flight attendants. We've had 7 congressional fatigue studies that were done that determined that fatigue exists today, and the best way to fight that fatigue is to get more rest. What was included in the FAA reauthorization bill was an increase of 2 hours rest to make sure that flight attendants have a chance to get closer to 8 hours rest in between flights. That has not been updated in the regulations as it was required by law, and there was no way to get at why it wasn't updated and how quickly it needs to be updated and implemented. So there was no way to get at these issues, just like the issues of addressing sexual harassment, of improving our training around human trafficking, and the other issues that I raised.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. The second issue you raised was that of secondary barriers. I think your words were that flight attendants were being asked to be serving as physical barriers, and you lauded the provision that included secondary barriers for new aircraft. If it makes sense for new aircraft, does it follow that it makes sense for current existing aircraft as well?
We completely support secondary barriers in all of our aircraft. It is an absurd practice to have flight attendants use their own bodies as the barrier between the cabin and the cockpit. And secondary barriers are a necessary plank of security.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Fitzpatrick. And now recognize the representative from the Sunflower State, Representative Davids.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, first I want to say thank you to the witnesses today. I really appreciate the opportunity to serve on the Aviation Subcommittee. Kansas is sometimes referred to as a flyover state, but we have an awful lot going on there. One of the things that's going on there is that we have a Regional Air Traffic Control Center in Olathe, Kansas, which is in the district that I represent. And I had the opportunity to go by and actually visit the facility and walk onto the floor where the folks who are navigating the planes were at. And the stress that I felt just walking through there was pretty intense, because you know that there are thousands of lives in the hands of the folks that are doing that. So I want to, because I've been, my mom was in the Army, now she works for the post office. So many people in my family have been federal employees and are career civil servants. And I want to thank Ms. Nelson and Mr. Bunce for, one, recognizing our federal civil service workers as both unsung heroes, and also calling out the sometimes demonization and that sort of thing, because our federal civil service really keeps this country going in a lot of ways. So one of the things I want to ask about is, I've heard a lot of questioning about safety, and I'd like to hear both actually from anyone who wants to respond to this, the kind of mental health of the folks who are under the stress of keeping so many of us safe while we're in the air, but also the impact that the shutdown had on their, sometimes it's morale, but it extends much further than that. I don't know if you've been hearing from, really, I feel like every single one of you, whether it's safety, the flight attendants, the air traffic controllers. Could you speak to that a bit?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you for the question. During the shutdown, and to an extent currently right now, because they're not made whole financially, it was demoralizing. They did their job. They did nothing wrong. They came to work. They were used as political pawns for an issue that, quite frankly, wasn't germane to aviation at all, and this has happened time and time again. We've seen, over a dozen opportunities for possible shutdowns in the last 18 months. We've experienced 3 shutdowns, and it is demoralizing to start working on programs that is going to get shut down and spend time away from your family to be a subject matter expert for the next generation of air traffic control equipment, and then not being able to implement this, and then now we're going to start back up, but it's going to take 6, 8 months to get back to normal. It is absolutely, I think that between the fatigue, the risk in the system, and the devalued that they felt coming to work day in and day out, will have lasting effects throughout their career.
Yeah, thank you. And, visiting the facility, you saw the air traffic controllers and where they work behind the scenes, below, back in the equipment room. Our folks have to maintain that equipment. They have to keep that up and running. And the pressure, the stress to make sure that it's running properly. Meanwhile, they have to think about their personal lives, their families, and all the other work, the distractions. And they're professionals. It takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for technicians at certain locations, sometimes longer. And they consider themselves, as the inspectors do, as our administrative support. We're all in this together and keeping the system safe. And to have a slap in the face again to say, you're not important. You don't. Some of them don't go to work. You get paid maybe eventually. Pulling savings out, pulling college out. There's some examples I have that one of the technicians said, I can't get my insulin. I'm not going to go to the doctor and get a surgery I need because I don't know how to pay for it. Meanwhile, he's certified in air traffic control equipment. His head's not in the game 100%, but yet they showed up every day to do the job they needed to do. Our inspectors, unfortunately, did not. So I know the question has been asked, is the system safe? Yes, it's safe, but now the inspectors have to go back and that pile of information that the industry sends over to the FAA for review, is there something that was missed? Did a plane take off that maybe should or shouldn't have? Did a pilot or someone have an issue? We don't know until they go through and comb through that. I believe, as Mr. Callio said and others, nobody's going to take off on an unsafe condition, but we don't know what we don't know. And these folks say, we want to do the job. Pay us, let us do our job. And that is going to, as Paul said, reverberate in new people. We just had a meeting yesterday in Oklahoma City with trainees, and we were out there talking to those folks. They're questioning whether they want to stay in the FAA now because of that. They're questioning, will it be another shutdown? Will there be another impact? Or should they go and find another job? So, yeah, it really is a demoralizing activity.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Davids. Now I want to recognize the pride of Dryden Township, Mr. Mitchell, Representative Mitchell of Michigan.
You should come visit Dryden sometime. Check out the horses.
Thanks for the invite.
Anytime you'd like. I'd like to say, I grew up in a family. Dad built trucks in the line. Mom works in the Salvation Army. We saw a lot of layoffs in the 60s and 70s in the auto industries. I was alive, by the way, when President Carter was here. I don't remember. I'll claim I don't remember what happened. What we saw at the shutdowns is that politics overwhelmed policy and people. This institution has already amazed me in my little over 2 years with its inability to have a level of maturity that gets things done. And it's dismaying some days. Mr. Larson, I would support your bill if we in fact had clear penalties on members of Congress and the staff for not getting their job done. Don't pay them. None of them. It's irresponsible. They shouldn't be. I put my letter into it to have my salary held the night before the shutdown went in. It was clear where it was going because people profiled about their issues rather than actually deal with the problem. But let me ask a couple of questions because I think adding drama to the situation. First, let me thank everyone here that did their jobs. Some of your folks came and visited me, and we talked to some length. Air traffic controllers came in to chat with me as well as TSA. Mr. Rinaldi, are you aware of any security, safety concerns that arose in the 35 days?
I'm not. What we are aware of is that the system is built on layers and redundancy of safety. It's just the ultimate safety net. And, you know, if you shut down for 3 or 4 days, you're not wearing that net out. But as you go 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and our processes aren't in place to mitigate risk and reduce the hazards that are identified, then you're increasing the risk in the system.
I wholly agree.
Yeah,
Having
okay.
people not paid for a month is unconscionable.
Well, I wasn't even talking about not being paid, not having people at work that actually do the safety functions.
Sure, I agree. I'll note that for Mr. Larson and others on the committee that, in fact, when we authorized FAA last term, we could have proceeded with privatizing air traffic control. It wouldn't have been in place by now, I readily admit. But in my opinion, we need to take some of these functions, air traffic control, we need to take certification of aircraft as much as we can. It is self-funded, and actually put it off in a private nonprofit, not unlike Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, there's a challenge I'd like to talk to you about, because we can get it outside of this alleged government process that fails to function on many days around here. Would you like to talk about that, sir? We should do that sometime. Quick question for you, Ms. Nelson. You referenced in your testimony some specific instances where there were concerns regarding failures of security or concerns about security in the air. I'm concerned about that. But I think rather than generic or general descriptions, I think we need more specifics about what transpired that led to these concerns. Because as I said to Mr. Rinaldi, on top of all the other stupidity around here, we did need more drama. So I'm curious what the examples are.
People were stretched to the nth degree. What we saw and at the security lines actually was really the best of America during this shutdown. Nobody likes to go through TSA security lines, and usually they're pretty grumpy about it. But what we saw was people coming with very good spirits, thanking the TSOs for being there, and being very grateful for them to continue to do their work even though they weren't getting paid. People were also not just thanking, they were trying to bring money, food, other gifts to try to sustain these people. And what we saw during this time was that, and obviously they're not supposed to accept any of that. We don't need people in a security-sensitive position accepting bribes. So this is one example of a security concern that we had, was that as the shutdown wore on, management was looking the other way when people were bringing these issues sometimes because of the human need, because there was such a strain on people, because they were having to go to food lines, because people were so stressed out. We also don't know what causes anyone to be in personal distress, but we know that there were people who were thrust into a hopelessness that had them saying things like, I'm not getting paid, it doesn't matter. Or my member tried to revive someone who took his life and was pushed really to the limit. Introducing that into a security sensitive place and not having the backing of the fully functioning FBI and the other agencies behind the scenes doing the risk analysis so that those TSOs can get those briefings every day were all part of the security concerns that we had and what we were seeing and where the system was breaking down.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Mitchell. Representative Lynch of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for your willingness to come to the committee and help us with your work. First of all, I want to just say how strongly I support H.R. 1108, Mr. DeFazio's bill. Just read it. It's 3 pages, a model of efficiency and a common sense piece of legislation, and I think we should get it done. I do want to point out, however, you know, a number of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have commented about the sadness of the shutdown and how we shouldn't let that happen again. I want to remind my colleagues who started this shutdown. The President took full credit for this. We had general agreement on a lot of bills across Congress. Matter of fact, this week we're going to have 7 appropriations bills that are basically agreed upon, bipartisan, House and Senate, that will proceed. It was the President's decision to take hostages, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, TSA workers. That's what we objected to. And to suggest that a member of Congress should give up their pay because the president decided to take hostages? Give me a break. Before coming to Congress, I was an iron worker for 20 years. I represented people for a living. I negotiated contracts on behalf of my workers, the men and women of the Iron Workers Union, the Carpenters Union, stagehands, wardrobe workers. I negotiated contracts with them, for them, on their behalf. Coming to Congress, I still do that for federal employees and other workers. Even when I took my members out on strike, when I asked my members, the men and women of my unions, to go on strike, I got paid because they wanted me in there fighting for them, that I would have no distractions and no backsliding, no backstepping. So I advised my colleagues on the Democratic side, take your pay, keep fighting. That's the attitude that the Democrats should have. It was the president's decision, reckless decision, irresponsible decision to shut this government down. Don't forget that. And any Democrat who's willing to negotiate with somebody who takes workers hostage should be disgraced. And I'm glad my colleagues did not do that. The starting pay for a TSO is about $28,000 a year. Are you kidding me? There are fast food places that pay more than that. So we shouldn't be surprised when TSOs making $28,000 a year with a 35-day shutdown are not coming back. And if we shut them, if the president shuts it down again, and we have basic agreement again between House and Senate on the bill to go forward and end the shutdown, if the president says no and shuts the government down again, we will face that same dilemma. And these TSOs, after that 35 days of, and some of them have not been paid yet, if they get put on furlough or laid off again, you can expect that they'll just walk. The job is tough enough as it is. So I agree. It's shameful that anyone would shut this government down. I mean, it just hurts the image of this government in the eyes of the American people who we all do work for. But taking hostages is not acceptable either. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Zanesville, home of the Fighting Blue Devils, and the Y Bridge, Mr. Balderson.
The Y Bridge. Thank you for recognizing that, Chairman. Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, thank you both for holding this hearing today. And I know from my constituents that the partial shutdown did cause significant hardship to pilots, air traffic controllers, and others in the aviation sector. I visited and communicated with them, making phone calls. That is one of the reasons, and I would ask my fellow colleague from Massachusetts to join on and co-sponsor a bill that Senator Portman and I did to end the Government Shutdowns Act to prevent this instability and future risk. And I appreciate all of you giving your input today and letting us know what the impacts are from your area of concern on the effects. My first question that I would like to ask is for Mr. Callio. Good morning, sir. Thank you for participating today. I want to discuss the financial impact of the shutdown on the airline industry. For example, the shutdown delayed Southwest plan to operate services to Hawaii. Can you share with the committee specific examples of how the shutdown financially impacted members of your organization?
As a proud Ohioan, I'm happy to try to answer your question.
OH.
I-O.
Order.
Just give us a moment. Mr. Balderson, as I mentioned earlier, we generally defer to our members to do that. That figure is well known. Southwest, it's roughly estimated about $15 million. There was another estimate for another airline at $25 million. I think the greater point here is in looking back to look forward, looking back, there's all sorts of cumulative impacts of the shutdowns that have been laid out here in terms of delays, The delays build up over time, create further delays down the line, so products don't come online, new planes don't come into service, new routes don't get written, new procedures don't get written, all of which has a huge financial impact on an industry that is the economic engine of this country. So while I can't quantify for you with any amount of certainty, I can say there are financial impacts that are immediate. There are financial impacts that will accumulate to the midterm and to the long term, and we can't let that happen again, which is why we support legislation that add certainty to FAA funding. So Mr. Rinaldi and I and our friends can quit talking about the need for stable funding all the time. We've been at it. It's kind of like Groundhog Day.
Thank you for answering your question, and it's good to see a fellow Ohioan. Back to Mr. Rinaldi, since you brought that up. Good morning, Mr. Rinaldi. And
Good morning.
As I said earlier, I did have the pleasure of touring the tower at Columbus Airport, now named the John Glenn International Airport, and have become a relationship with Mike Weekly there, and it's always good to work with Mike. And someone talked about the facility in Oklahoma and the training facility, and that's something that I'm going to discuss in the near future pertaining to workforce development and the backlog that's there, and you know, getting folks encouraged to go in this industry. But have you had any conversations about backup plans in case there is a future shutdown? But hopefully we pass my bill that does not happen.
Well, as far as backup plans for future shutdowns, you know, working with the agency as we approach a shutdown, the interesting thing is about 10 days out, we start exchanging lists of who would be what we would say exempt, non-exempt. They used to say essential, non-essential, and that's not politically correct, so it's exempt, non-exempt. We think the FAA, all employees of the FAA are essential and need to come to work to continue to run the safe, most efficient system in the world. And we would like to see stable, predictable funding and make sure that we never have to see these shutdowns again. Because even if we don't shut down tomorrow night, I think that is, we have already been planning for a shutdown for 10 days. That is detrimental to aviation because we're not modernizing the system, we're not moving forward, we're taking 2 steps backwards every time we come up to a date that looks like a shutdown.
Thank you. One follow-up for you, and back to that workforce development piece and attracting outside of the shutdown concern. Can you discuss any ongoing plans to recruit folks to get into this line of work?
We have a number of people that want to become air traffic controllers. The agencies, we have different tracks of hiring, whether it's from the military or prior experience, certainly off the street or in our college programs. So there are a good pool of people that want this job. The problem is getting them through, you know, the testing, then security, the medical, and getting them through Oklahoma Academy, which has limited seats, and we've lost basically 2 months of limited seats.
Okay. I look forward to working with you on that. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And now the representative from the state whose state beverage is milk. Angie Craig, Representative Craig from Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. So I was sworn into the United States Congress 12 days into this shutdown. And since 1996, we've had 22 continuing resolutions and 10 government shutdowns. So as I come into this Congress, I take a fresh look if what we've been doing is working. And I want to say to you that that's why I have supported a freshman bill called the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns. Not only does it send us into a continuing resolution, but it also makes sure that our elected leaders are here every single day for daily quorum calls. It also takes away pay because I believe if your hardworking federal government employees are not being paid, neither should we, and we should come to work every day and fight like hell for you, even though we're not being paid. So I have come in, I believe, a number of the freshmen with fresh eyes, looking at the way this Congress is working. I will support the chairman's, both Chairman Lawson and DeFazio's legislation 1108 because I believe in the interim of figuring out how we stop all shutdowns, we certainly should stop our national airspace having the risks that we currently have. Mr. Rinaldi, thank you so much for being here this morning and representing air traffic controllers. As you may know, I have a regional air traffic control center in my congressional district in Farmington, Minnesota, otherwise known as the Minneapolis Air Route Traffic Control Center. I'll try not to be offended by it being called Minneapolis, and it's in Farmington. But it's the 13th busiest center in the United States. And I want to share a few of the stories of the air traffic controllers in my center. I want to talk about Joe, Jeremy, and Kelly. Joe was a new father of a baby born 10 weeks prematurely. He had his leave canceled, and he had to decide whether he would come to work every day or go to the NICU and see his newborn. Jeremy was a father of 3 who was on the verge of having to take out significant credit card debt just to pay his bills. And Kelly is a trainee with student loan debt, and she had to wonder how she was going to continue to meet those requirements. So each of them, on behalf of their communities, came to work every single day, not just on behalf of their communities, but on behalf of communities that they will never, ever know. They came to work every day, and they did their job. So I want to ask you, Mr. Rinaldi, and every single one of you, we're staring down another government shutdown. And although I am optimistic, because that tends to be my nature, I want you to tell us what message you would have for Congress and for the administration. On Saturday morning, if you wake up and this government is shut down again, in 1 or 2 sentences, what is your message to us?
It's been the message while during the shutdown is open the government. There's no reason for federal employees to be held hostage for a political dispute that has nothing to do with them. Congress, Senate, White House need to do their job. They're elected to do their job, keep the government open. I thank you for your legislation. We will support any legislation that meets our 4 core principles, that, supports our frontline workforce, that certainly gives us stable, predictable funding and gets us out of this shutdown mode. I thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Congresswoman. Yeah, same thing. Keep the government open, do your job, pay the folks, because it's a critical disservice to them that they do not come to work, or if they show up, some have to show up Saturday morning, midnight, Friday night, because they work rotating shifts, and have to think again, here we go. How long are we going to go? But yet they're going to do everything they can. So do your job, Congress. Do your job, administration. Sign whatever it takes to keep the government, the FAA open, and really for all federal employees. Thank you.
Thank you. Airlines for America would say that, number 1, operating crisis to crisis is a terrible way to do business, whether it be in Congress or anywhere else. Secondly, compromise is not a dirty word. And thirdly, A4A also will support any legislation that prevents a future government shutdown. I would say this, because I'm one of the old-timers here, don't try to bite off too much. Seize the moment right now. Get 1108 done and move on from there.
We take our role seriously of keeping the American public out of danger. And if Congress chooses chaos on Saturday morning, working people have power, and we will come together and use it, and we will stop the chaos.
Thank you.
I'd just say do your jobs and don't leave town until it's done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative Craig. Representative Spano from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to serve with you, and thank you for being here. Very grateful for your testimony and your expertise and the work that you all do to keep us safe. It means a great deal to me as one who's never flied too much until very recently. So thank you very much. A couple of questions for you. I, too, would reiterate, just echo what the other members of the committee said in terms of there really being absolutely no excuse for the government to shut down. We have a job to do, and we need to do it. And I think the nation has a right to expect us to do it. And so we'll look forward to working with those out there that do have bills that would continue the government and would prevent this type of scenario from happening in the future. So I look forward to working with the members to that effect. I do have a few questions. The first question I would direct, if I may, to Ms. Nelson. You had mentioned, and you just reiterated, I think, or alluded to it a moment ago, just in your response to the previous question. But you said in your testimony, if Congress will not put an end to the crisis, we will take action to save lives and protect U.S. aviation. My assumption by that is that that means you would go on strike. Is that an accurate assumption?
No, that is not an accurate assumption. It may be every single day in aviation today, if we see an unsafe condition, we are charged to raise our hand and say it's unsafe. Now, we run the safest transportation system in the world, really proud of that, and all of us participate in that. But when we see something that's unsafe, we will raise our hands and we will not work that flight until that's corrected. So that is a possibility. That is not what I am saying is definitely going to happen. What I'm saying is that we are calling all American people to come to the airports and demand that Washington do its job and keep the government open.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Mr. Perrone. How long, in your opinion, do you think it will take for FAA operations until they're back to normal?
Thank you, Congressman. That's tough to say. Like I said, the shutdown, even the 2013 shutdown, it took a long time to catch up. And now on top of that, we have 35 days of shutdown. Our inspectors are trying to do what they need to do. I mean, there was aircraft crash that they just put tape around and nobody could inspect it, the NTSB, the FAA inspectors, and it just sat there. There was violations that occurred that timed out, some that didn't get put into the system in a timely manner. But again, every day, there's new work that they need to do. So it's hard to say, but it's going to take a long time. As Mr. Bunch said, there's aircraft certification that didn't happen. There's pilot certificates that didn't happen. And that continues to add to the frustration. And if our inspectors are, and we've had a few already say, we're leaving, we're going back to industry, it's going to be a shortfall of staffing. And then with the academy being shut down, you can't train new inspectors. So it's a compounding problem.
Can you give me an understanding or an idea of what the functions were that your members continued to perform during the shutdown and what they did not perform?
So from the aviation inspector side, none of that work was done or completed. So there's a safety program volunteered by the industry that says, hey, we have an issue or concern. It goes over to the FAA inspector to analyze. That just sat in their inbox until the inspectors came back. There was pilots that needed to either be recertified or given licenses that was not completed. Now, the registry was open this time around versus 2013 because the industry said last time that the registry not having their aircraft certified or registered to sell, they stayed open. Procedures were limited, so new procedures that normally take a certain amount of time were delayed. Our technicians worked. They worked without pay the whole time. What they couldn't do is some of the modifications, as Paul has said, some of the new equipment, or I should say modifications to existing equipment couldn't be completed. They were only allowed to do safety-related equipment, certify the existing equipment for air traffic control. They couldn't do other type of work. And we had a lot of administrative folks that were non-essential or non-accepted, that paperwork sat around.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Caleo, and that is you testified about the shutdown's impact on next-gen programs. So my question to you is, are your member airlines still in line to meet the next-gen ADS-B equipage deadline for January 2020?
We're working on that with the FAA, but all of these shutdowns create a slowdown because nobody could work on it for 35 days. And if there's another shutdown, that will further delay it. And we've had those kind of delays a number of times over the last 7 years. So every shutdown, like I keep saying, has a cumulative impact. So, you know, we're working towards it. Our expectation is to try to meet it. We'll see.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Carson, Representative Carson from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Bunch. This question is for Mr. Bunch and Bunce and anyone else who would like to answer. You know, during the shutdown, our office received an urgent request for help with the Indiana Organ Donation Network to get their flights off the ground. They needed to get new aircraft to help surgeons who collect organ donations and then fly them to perform surgeries to even deliver the organs. This life-saving network was interrupted during the shutdown when certification personnel were essentially furloughed. I'm sure you've seen more than we have the examples of this kind of thing in general aviation. I'm hoping you or any of the panelists can give us a better picture of how the shutdown impacted this particular sector.
Sir, in this particular case, they were taking delivery of 2 business jets, and the operating company that worked these aircraft have quite a few flights that they do over a Midwest region that includes the state of Indiana. And it's just an example of what happens all throughout the system, because pilots have retraining requirements that they have to do to be able to fly a business jet. So when you go back to training in a training center, the training center has to have the most current equipment that you have on that aircraft in the simulator. So those manuals have to be approved each and every time that the manufacturer or in this case, someone that's moving organs does a modification of their aircraft. You have to, that ripples into the system. And so the FAA has to approve each one of those manual changes. So you impact the pilot training, you impact the delivery of the aircraft when you've got to make modifications to it. And so that happened throughout the country. Take, for instance, firefighting. Up in Mr. DeFazio's state, they had to do modifications to get these aircraft ready to be able to bid on contracts for the upcoming fire season. If they didn't have the modifications in place, they couldn't submit the proper bid because they can't say they have equipment on the aircraft certified that they don't have. So all of a sudden they miss a year of bidding on contracts for important elements like firefighting that we have to do. So it happened across the country in many different sectors that do these public service type of flying.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Carson. Go with Representative Katko of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Mr. Callio, I think you summed it up perfectly when you said that compromise is not a dirty word. And at the heart of what causes shutdowns, in my mind, is an inability to compromise, political posturing, and gamesmanship that catches a lot of people in the crosshairs. And the lack of consideration for those people is stunning to me. Mr. Perone, what you touched on and what others touched on are some of the intangibles that happen in the security arena. Yes, thank God you didn't have a security event during this time, but when you have someone like a TSA employee, and I have oversight over TSA for the last 4 years, and I continue to, and I'm glad to be on this committee as well because it's in the aviation sector, which I'm very, very interested in from a safety and security standpoint. You're paying someone peanuts at TSA. They don't have all the protections of other agency employees have. And then you're asking them to work for free. And then you're asking them to try and find the proverbial needle in the haystack, knowing that something as small as this could take down an airline, my cell phone. We're flirting with fire. We are absolutely positively flirting with fire. And I look at the aircraft inspection security, it's the same thing. And you can apply that to anything, not just TSA. So the more that we use shutdowns as a political tool, the more we're really flirting with disaster. And I've never voted for a shutdown. I've never voted to keep the government closed, and I never will. And the consequence will be damned to me politically because it's more important that we do our jobs, and we abdicate our responsibility when we don't do that. So with that in mind, I think it's sometimes helpful to identify with some particularity the impacts, and we've talked generally about them. So I want to ask, maybe ask Mr. Bunce first. Maybe Nick, you can think about something from the airline side. But from the manufacturer side, I used some examples during the shutdown of unintended consequences from a financial standpoint, because people think, oh, you just shut down the government, you're saving money, we don't need these employees. Well, it's much worse than that. Airline inspectors, you can't get your planes, new manufactured planes out of your plant because they can't be certified because FAA inspectors weren't around. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
All right, so can you give me an idea from a dollar amount what that costs from the manufacturing side to have those planes stacked up and not being delivered for 35 days?
So for each company, as Mr. Callio said, for the airlines, each company has an individual case. But let me give you one.
I'm talking about from a manufacturing standpoint.
Yes,
yeah.
but so each company is different. So for a big company that had, I mentioned, a burn rate of $10 million in a major development program, that's one economic impact. For another company, small company, that's maybe got just one product line, and you're upgrading to, let's say, a new processor that does more work. If you go and you look at the supply chain, all of a sudden you got to make a decision, a bet, that the FAA is going to certify your product by a certain date, and you got to turn off delivery of the old processor and start ordering the new ones because you have to have lead time in the supply chain. all of a sudden now you can't get that new product out the door. You run out of the old processor, and now you're stuck. And if your product line is very small, this can put you in a situation where now you have to try to go out to the markets and find bridge funding. And who wants to invest in an industry that's so reliant on the government that they have these stops and starts? So it does have a significant ripple effect.
Mr. Kelly, I know you mentioned some dollar figures. You have any hard figures for your industry as a whole as to how much they were impacted by this? I mean, I look at some of the new routes that you said in your testimony were being affected that weren't being able to go into operation. You're not taking delivery of new airplanes, which are more efficient from a fuel standpoint, and from you're waiting for those new routes. Maybe you had to cancel routes. All those things come into consideration that people don't take account of. So is there anything else you want to add to that?
Not to that, because I've said we can't quantify the figure, but there is a figure there. I would like to mention TSA because of your work on TSA, and thank you, along with Chairman DeFazio, for your work in trying to stop the diversion of TSA fees for non-security purposes. Yes. That was an area of the system that was stressed. And passengers are paying every day into that system. Same with CBP, where there was
That's why you introduced a bill to pay them out of that fund, yeah.
Yes. So why stop it? So there are things to do here, and I think doing it on a bipartisan basis is exactly the approach that has to happen. And again, I would encourage all the committee, without being presumptuous, I hope, strike while the iron's hot. People are thinking about this now.
Mr. Perone, real quickly, was the aviation safety inspectors at the foreign repair stations impacted by this at all?
Yeah, there was none done during that 35-day period.
We are flirting with fire, my friend.
So we had security issues.
We are, aren't we? We're flirting with fire.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Thank you. I recognize Representative Garcia from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair Larson and Ranking Member Graves. So once again, we're possibly on the cusp of yet another potential government shutdown. It is for this reason that I'm very happy to join Chairman DeFazio and Subcommittee Chairman Larson in co-sponsoring the Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2019. This bill would ensure that all FAA programs, projects, and activities would continue uninterrupted during a future government shutdown. While we talk about the effects of shutdowns, I want to make sure that we keep at the fore the human impact shutdowns have on real hard-working people. This morning, I met a TSA agent working at O'Hare Airport, one of the busiest in the country. Christine worked hard to buy her manufactured or mobile home in Chicago, where she and her 23-year-old son live. During the last shutdown, Christine had to pull out the $200 she had in savings just to buy food and gas. At one point, Christine called out because she didn't have enough money to make her 22-mile commute to work. On January 10th, Christine was served a 5-day notice of eviction. In a recent interview, she recounted the internal dialogue she had during the shutdown. Quote, "How long can we last? I've got a $15 gift card and it's 2 degrees out this morning. What the heck am I going to do?" Quote, "I'm worried about my car and I'm worried about losing my home. Even if the government is reopened, this has hurt us tremendously. We missed paychecks and there will be late fees. Who would work at a job for 1 month and not get a paycheck?" Mr. Chairman, I also listened to stories of air traffic controllers who were on the brink of resigning because they were being forced to make the decision on whether to come to work or find another job to pay the bills. In fact, amidst the shutdown, I joined my Illinois delegation colleagues at O'Hare to hear directly from workers about the problems they faced. There were over 600 air traffic controllers and other aviation professionals who live and work throughout northern Illinois, including my district. One controller whose wife had been diagnosed with a heart condition while their first child was in the middle of medical tests fell into quite deep hardship. You see, dealing with medical conditions is more difficult at the beginning of the year because working families have not yet met their insurance deductibles and have a larger out-of-pocket responsibility. In St. Louis, there were reports of a young air traffic controller selling his plasma just to make his monthly payments. These are simply devastating stories of real individuals suffering from the political gamesmanship that threatens shutdown after shutdown. This brinksmanship has the effect of reducing federal employees, contractors, and their families to mere political bargaining chips. During the shutdown, Chicago Center was in the middle of implementing new equipment which will enhance communication abilities with pilots. This equipment is commonly known as datacom. Once the shutdown started, training and implementation stopped. NATCA estimates that $1.5 million was spent on training, was lost, and will need to be reaccomplished next fall or later. Not only did new equipment training come to a halt, but on-the-job training was ground to a standstill as well. I thank all of the witnesses who have come here today to show us what the full impact of a shutdown on aviation is. I do have a question for Mr. Rinaldi. As I understand, about 20% of current air traffic controllers eligible to retire, and the current 30-year low in staffing, there's a critical need for new controllers to expand airport capacity at O'Hare and Midway and other large airports. What will the impact of the shutdown on encouraging air traffic controllers to retire and on the ability to hire new controllers?
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your passion and your support for the federal workers. We really appreciate that. As far as, you know, we're still in catch-up mode from the shutdown of 2013. The sequester that kicked in, the FAA closed the academy, and then we had the October shutdown for 16 days. The academy was closed for a full year, and we're still catching up there. If we shut down again, the catch-up will be well into the 2025 mode.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. I recognize Representative Woodall from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Mr. Rinaldi. Anytime bad things happen and folks are focused, you either have a chance to have your stock rise or your stock fall. I don't think folks realize your members were working 60-hour weeks before shutdowns and 60-hour weeks during shutdowns and 60-hour weeks after shutdowns. And that's just the kind of work that your members do day in and day out. And at least from the metropolitan Atlanta area, where we count on your folks to show up and do their very best absolutely every single day, I know things were getting tough at the well, from the beginning to the end, but your folks showed up and did what America was asking them to do, and folks are grateful. So I just wanted you to know that that certainly did not go unnoticed.
Thank you.
We're spending a lot of time these days talking about the demise of the aviation industry, not because of shutdowns, but because we'll stop flying planes, because we'll have lots of new alternative modes of transportation to replace our aviation industry. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but I know the aviation industry has been working hard to take care of its carbon footprints, to reduce emissions, to do what the private sector always does, which is try to be the very best corporate citizen it has. I was hoping Mr. Bunce and Mr. Callio could take just a moment and talk to me about what has been going on in the industry to try to be the very best steward of the environment that you can be, to continue making advancements, whether the government mandates them or not.
Yes, sir. I think I join my colleagues here. I am extremely proud of what we've been able to do as an industry. This industry came together. We went up to ICAO, which is the United Nations for Aviation up in Montreal, came together and arrived at a carbon standard or a CO2 standard that now is applied worldwide. We have programs going on to be able to use what's called sustainable alternative jet fuel. And obviously, Mr. Callio's membership uses the bulk of that fuel, but we in business aviation, everybody that's using turbine fuel, jet fuel, will be able to meet our goals if we're able to go ahead and start producing or getting the demand for this and having refiners be able to give us that type of fuel. On the piston side, for avgas, this committee has been tremendous supporters for us of a program that we're doing to be able to make that fuel more clean. So in so many areas, this industry is working together, and because the whole planet is relying on aviation, and we have this new exciting dimension coming out of an ability to use electric and hybrid propulsion, which is even going to make us further green. So it's a very exciting time in aviation, and we're doing our part for environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. As Mr. Bunce laid out, there's a lot that's been going on, and the industry has come together to do it. Please forgive my voice. But I'd point out that between 1978 and 2017, aviation reduced its emissions by 125%. That's the equivalent of taking 25 million cars off the road every year. In addition to that, we've carried 34% more passengers at the same time and more cargo as we did in 2000 without emitting any more carbon dioxide. We have aspirational goals for the years coming up, short-term and long-term, that would take more off. And so, you know, the proposals are nice, but the world can't live without aviation. We all know that. I tried to book a high-speed rail train to Brussels. I couldn't get one. So we're going to have to keep planes in the air, but we have to do better. And it's a multi-pronged effort from the manufacturers to everybody across the board. From our perspective, the less fuel we burn, the better.
I appreciate that. We spend a lot of time challenging each other to do better. I wish we spent as much time celebrating the successes when we achieve them. It's worth celebrating, and I'm grateful to you for sharing it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. The entire subcommittee will have an opportunity to show their love for the greening of aviation, aerospace, and airports at some time in the future when we have a hearing. I look forward to everyone's full support for the things we need to do, including having been mocked on the floor of the House 10 years ago for introducing even a sense of Congress for an emissions trading system during the cap and trade debate. I'm glad we're all catching up to where I am. I appreciate that. So with that, I recognize for 5 minutes Representative Norton from the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it is important that you quickly held this hearing so we can learn from it, particularly since we don't know if there's going to be another shutdown. And I'd like to ask about the actions of the industry in light of in preparation for shutdowns. I suppose I should go to Mr. Khalil first. Everyone saw the shutdown coming. We just couldn't believe it would really occur. But there it was, and of course there have been shutdowns in prior years repeatedly, and we've been unable to stop them. I don't know whether some of the bills that are coming forward will ever have that effect, because there are some negatives to those bills as well. So in seeing this shutdown coming, were there actions that the industry took or could take, and in light of the fact that although we believe the present bill the current bill will be signed, are there actions being taken in preparation for a possible shutdown as we speak here today?
Thank you, Madam Congresswoman. Yes, from our perspective, there's always planning operationally and what we can do, in which we have to anticipate what will happen with the rest of our partners in the aviation community as a shutdown progresses and how we can make it up. Frankly, there's a lot of piecing and patching that takes place to try to get airplanes in the air, to keep airplanes in the air, to handle the fact that we can't get new planes certified, the fact that we can't get airworthiness directives approved, the fact that the FAA inspectors are out of the system, well, you know, who we welcome because we need and want the oversight. So it's a lot of...
You will be flying during a shutdown.
Yes, we will be
So
flying.
are there actions with planes going to be in the air that you take or must take when you know that there's going to be a shutdown?
Yeah, we have to take overall account for what's going to be in the system and what the level of capability is to fly what number of planes and which number of
I'm concerned.
passengers.
So do you, if there's going to be shutdown with various parts of your staff or various parts of the system, I should say, not being paid and therefore not sure that they'll be there, are there actions that are taken, considering that planes do not stop circulating during that time? For example, are there fewer planes in the air? we were told that there were long periods of times when planes could not safely land. Those are the kinds of safety issues I'm interested in.
Well, what happens is, depending on the capability of the rest of the system, what the FAA will do is decrease the number of planes in the air, will stretch out the timing between flights, all of which slows the entire system down. And
decreasing the number of planes, it may mean you have to cancel some flights?
yes, absolutely, which has a terrible impact on the people who are trying to fly, for the people and businesses that are waiting for their packages, and all of the knock-on effects for the surrounding communities, for people not flying, not going to hotels. It all in all is a bad situation. Again, what we need to do is look forward and pass a bill like 1108, which will prevent any future shutdowns in this industry and allow for stable funding so we can make long-term plans rather than have to plan for shutdowns.
Do any of the rest, any other witnesses have anything to say?
I would just add to that. Every time we approach a lapse in appropriations in the FAA, about 2 weeks out, we start scaling down our modernization activity. We certainly start looking at our list of who's essential, non-essential, who's going to be coming to work. And basically, we stop moving the organization and the industry forward because we actually have to take a step back to actually prepare for the incoming shutdown or the eventual shutdown if it happens. And all too often in high drama, Congress will pass it on the 11th hour and give us another 2 weeks. Well, all that does is give us another 2 weeks to prepare for another shutdown because those lists change all the time. It is an endless circle with the hamster just pouring away of going nowhere because we're preparing for shutdowns. It's ridiculous. It needs to end.
I just want to thank all our witnesses who had to confront this shutdown, that you were able to keep the United States of America safe in the air during the shutdown. So we owe you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Norton. Move to now grant 5 minutes to Representative Carbajal of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for being here and sharing with us the important work the industries and the workers you represent do day in and day out to keep us all safe. Mr. Rinaldi, in your testimony, you mentioned the personal toll the 35-day shutdown took on air traffic controllers. In my district, I represent 3 airports: Santa Maria, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo, community airports. I personally met with a number of air traffic controllers and other airport workers in my district who echoed some of the same concerns you outlined in your testimony. Many were anxious as to when their next paycheck would come or when the shutdown would end. For some of the workers in my district, this took an extraneous toll on their personal lives, as some were recovering from losing friends and family members or homes during the Thomas Fire and Montecito debris flow. Can you speak further how the shutdown impacted staffing for smaller community airports?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you for your passion for our members. Certainly, I'm assuming you're talking about Tricia Passeri, Devic, that has been out there. She lost her home. They lost everything they had during the fires. Then to continue to come to work and not get paid while they're trying to rebuild their home a year later is devastating and demoralizing. And it's around the country. It's not just at our core 30 airports or our large en route centers or our core 30 TRACONs. It's every airport out there. Controllers showed up every day to maintain the safety of the national airspace system with the uncertainty of when they were going to get a paycheck, and it weighed on them. And they were doing side jobs just to put food on the table. And they didn't know how long it was going to last because there was a lot of rhetoric that was going on that this could go on for months or years. And people were really, really concerned at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Rinaldi. Mr. Bunce, this shutdown took a huge toll on our economy. Could you share with us a little bit of the impact that this shutdown had on the aviation manufacturing industry? What did it do to many of those production lines? What was the fiscal impact?
Again, it's because each company has a different level of activity and where they are in a production process of new aircraft. It could be all from one company was very close to bankruptcy to another company was just burning a tremendous amount of cash, but they had more product lines to be able to absorb it. So I can't give you a quantification of the overall dollar amount of impact. But what you really do in that situation is you hurt our ability to be able to service markets all over the world, because if you look at content-wise, most of the aircraft that are delivered in this very competitive marketplace have a lot of U.S. content. So one example, there was an Italian company during the shutdown that was supposed to have FAA test pilots come over and fly the test aircraft in icing conditions in Europe so that they could deliver to a U.S. airline that's here on the East Coast. Those aircraft have significant amount of U.S. content. Now, all of that flight test now, they don't know when they're going to be able to get it done, and they may miss the icing season that they needed to be able to get those tests done. So even what's happening overseas is impacting U.S. companies here because of the global nature of our trade back and forth.
Thank you. Clearly, we've been told that the impact was over $11 billion to our economy, $3 billion of which we will not be able to get back. That was part of our GDP. So thank you for sharing, and thank you all again for the work you do and those you represent. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Carbajal. We'll now move to a second round of questions, and I will start by recognizing Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rinaldi, do you believe that the FAA is going to hit its FY19 targets for training controllers?
For training controllers or hiring controllers?
For
hiring through the academy?
I'm trying to remember their target. Was their target for training or hiring?
It's for hiring through the FAA Academy.
Well, hiring then.
I believe they're going to struggle to make that. They're going to try, but I think through the process and through the limited seats in the classes out in Oklahoma City, they're certainly going to try, but I think they're going to miss their target this year.
Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on what we could be doing, or I guess more specifically what the FAA could be doing to address the failure rate of those graduating from the academy?
Well, the failure rate is actually at the academy, the screen, right? So, you know, we much prefer that we would screen them out at the academy than to bring people that quite possibly are not qualified into our facilities and train them on live traffic if they don't have the skills and the aptitude to become an air traffic controller, a certified air traffic controller. So those screens that are happening out in the academy, roughly, depending on the class, it goes from 50, 60, sometimes success rate. I think that's a good path, because the end product that we're getting out of the academy, we're seeing a higher success rate at our larger facilities.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Perone, do you have any other ideas on things we could be doing to help address or I guess mitigate some of the safety impacts from that you've raised from the shutdown?
Thank you. I think the biggest thing is keep the government open, keep people employed, and making it where they want to come to the agency and continue to keep the safest system in the world. You know, the FAA reauthorization bill has some training and staffing models that we haven't got to yet because we were just starting, and then the shutdown occurred, so we need to get involved in that. It's just important that the government stays open, our folks. You know, we have people that go to Oklahoma City and get trained other locations continually throughout their career. It's not a one-time event. So the academy has to stay open for people to get trained. New equipment comes on board, they have to get out there to get trained, and then go back and get on-the-job training and certification of equipment. So it's a continuing process for us. It's not just a one-time, here's a new hire and that's it. Myself, I spent over 2.5 years in the academy in training. So it's important to keep everything going. The FAA reauthorization bill has training that we're working, want to work with the FAA, other ways, other avenues of getting them trained, locally, colleges, other events. So we appreciate keeping the government open.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson, I believe other folks commented on the performance FAA leadership. Just curious if you had any reaction or, in regard to their performance or suggestions on how things could be done differently in the event we'd run into an awful situation like this in the future.
I appreciate the leadership of the FAA and certainly of all the people who came and tried to keep the system running and make it safe. When they talk about pulling down capacity and efficiency, that is a direct impact on my members' jobs. And the conditions that the air traffic controllers were describing here that they were put in where they were having to make a determination to keep the system safe, that efficiency rate would have to go down, the capacity rate would have to go down, could result in massive furloughs for airline workers and cascading effect from there. So we actually appreciate Administrator Elwell's very close watch on this and work with us, but the fact of the matter is that we were hearing both out of the FAA and the TSA that the only way to keep us safe is to have certain long-term funding.
Thank you. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make note there were a few comments about the shutdown that were made, and I want to commend and associate myself with the comments from Mrs. Craig regarding the members not being paid. And I think also her comments regarding members having to show up, mandatory showing up 7 days a week. I think that is absolutely what needs to happen. And let me just go back, and I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the people you represent, and say it again. I think it's awful that the folks that were impacted by this didn't deserve it, and they couldn't solve it. I think that's wrong, and I think for us to continue to be paid under that scenario is inappropriate. It takes two sides standing negotiation, and while Chairman DeFazio and Mr. Larson have introduced legislation that mitigates this impact in the aviation industry, I do think that we need to be focusing more broadly on shutdowns as well. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Representative Graves. So just to wrap up, we had a question and a couple of other additional comments. The question I have is for Ms. Nelson. Would you like to clarify your comments on the general strike and what that actually means?
I'd be happy to. So we have called for a general strike in response to this shutdown. And the reason for that is because nowhere in private industry would anyone come to work without getting paid. Through all the pain that we went through as aviation workers during the bankruptcies, the first day order in those bankruptcies was to make sure everyone got paid. And there was no determination of who was essential and who was non-essential. The only way to keep the business running is to have everybody chip in and make sure that it works and make sure that people get paid. So we had 2 million people who were not getting paid here and others who were forced to come to work without pay. This was unprecedented, and we believe that it requires an unprecedented response. So we were calling on all workers to talk about a general strike in response to this. If Congress can't do their job and can actually or if Washington can't do its job and can actually put us in a position where people are thrown into hopelessness, 2 million American workers and the rest of us who were feeling the impacts of that, where this doesn't happen anywhere else in the country, where we have said over and over again that we do not agree with making people come to work without getting paid, then it requires an unprecedented response from the American people. And so we know that maybe we're not ready to have a general strike. We haven't even talked about it in this country for over 50 years. We believe that the conditions were that serious that we needed to talk about it. Separately, our members will continue to assess the conditions at work if there is a continued shutdown. And in situations where we believe that it is unsafe, we will withhold our service and not go to work and make sure that the American people are safe.
Okay, thank you. I just asked unanimous consent the following items to be entered in the record of today's hearing: 2 additional written statements from the National Business Aviation Association and the Regional Airlines Association. Without objection, so ordered. And finally, I just want to note about the National Transportation Safety Board. Had to furlough employees. The NTSB is the independent agency responsible for investigating transportation accidents and advocating for safety improvements. It stopped work on more than 1,800 ongoing general aviation and limited aviation safety investigations, and it prevented the board from working with the FAA to investigate 15 general aviation accidents that occurred during the 35 days. So I want to be sure that was clear and in the record. And if there are, let's see, no further questions from the subcommittee, and seeing none, I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your contribution to today's discussion has been informative, it has been helpful, and I hope we have set the record, set down into the record what the impacts of a shutdown is on aviation and aerospace. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.